head of the biorefinery, a unit within a biobank, the integrated biobank of Luxembourg. So the biorefinery is, as what the name it says, we are refining biomaterial in order to give them to the scientists for doing their work with. So within the biobank, it's only one unit. We have more units, but I'm trying to present to you how we see ourselves within this sample flow from the patient or the donor up to the researcher in order to improve the quality of the sample, to get this better data, and in the end, of course, to get better science. The thought line of this is, is for better samples is all about the reproducibility of the research. You might have heard already multiple times that what has been published in PubMed and all the other journals is very difficult to reproduce. And that really undermines the quality of the information which is going out. And why is it always that it is so difficult to reproduce? Well, the guy Carrero has already done an investigation years ago in 2007. He is looking at the different aspects of the problems which are causing the irreproducibility of the research, where what we can see is that the majority is related to what we have here, the pre-analytical errors, which is more than half of those elements which are causing the irreproducibility. Other aspects are the analytical errors, and other aspects are the post-analytical errors. So what is a pre-analytical error? I will come to that more in detail. That is the part from the sample collection all the way up to doing the analysis. The analytical error itself is doing the analysis, and post the analysis, you can still do all kinds of work, which might also cause errors. So how to address the pre-analytical errors? That is trying to get standardization involved. Standardization is something where you can really gain a lot of, let's say, harmonization in sample collection, processing, and other aspects. How do you reduce the amount of analytical errors? What we aim for here is going into automation, use more robots, use less people. Unfortunately, for the people, we make more errors than robots, and as such, automation is a good way to reduce the amount of analytical errors, or at least the variability which is coming in there. And for the post-analytical errors, it is trying to add quality control in all of the processes that you're going to apply. So it's trying to get standardization by centralized processing, also having your processing methods really good described in standard operating procedures. Add the characterization methods also standardized, and apply everywhere where you can quality control measures. Coming back to the idea of what is the analytical variability, I'll give you an example of the cascade of possibilities of variabilities which are encountered in a sample's lifetime. This is not exhaustive, this is not completely complete. It is just a group of data to just show the amount of variability which is coming up to you by the time point you might get a data point in the end from your, for example, DNA sequencing and stuff like that. So what we have here is a donor. The donor has variabilities on age, sex, and activities, but there are much more variabilities in there. This is just an example. Then you have the sample collection from the donor. And it's the sample tube which is different. For example, for plasma and for serum, we use a total different tube. But for example, for cell-free DNA, which is the one we use in cancer very much, there are several companies who produce different tubes for doing the same thing, but they do have bias. So it's the tube which is already there. If you go to the sample logistics, it is the transfer of the sample. If you are in a hospital where you collect in the operating theater on the 3rd floor your sample and you bring it down to the laboratory on the 1st floor, this is not so much a big issue. But what we see over here in the biobank, that we have pan-European collections and really centralized processing and storage, we must have those samples transported over hundreds of kilometers away with good temperature and controlled time points. Because you can also understand the time difference between a collection of a blood sample and the time that we process it is very important for the quality of the sample and the internal degradation. Then the sample processing itself. For your DNA extraction, you can use multiple kits from multiple companies. The difference between using magnetic beads or using silicon-based columns is giving a big impact on the quality and the actually downstream implications of your DNA. So you have to be very careful what type of processing you're going to apply and which procedure. Coming to the analytics themselves. There are multiple platforms who are doing all kinds of analyses, and we know every platform has its own bias. So for this, you already know that if you work on a Roche platform or if you work on a PerkinElmer platform, you will not have exactly the same type of data. And then you have your data, and then you do data processing afterwards, and you can still come up to all kinds of variabilities. For example, what we see in our side is when we have a pipeline for doing our microbiome analysis, pipeline X with the same amount of data put in pipeline Y are just giving different results. All these together are giving all kinds of variabilities, and they are part of this irreproducibility of the science. And that's the part that we want to come in, of course, from the biobank, where we really advocate that we are going to standardize as much as possible. So this standardization will give us the high quality biomaterial, which is there to be used for the science part. For what we see as a main important element is to have your samples, what we call fit for purpose. So if we know the purpose at the end of the process, so the principal investigator who at the end is going to use that type of specimen, we know exactly what is the best way to collect your samples and to process your samples. And by having it completely harmonized, by having it completely traceable, by having it completely registered into our laboratory information management system, we can easily have all the data presented and also reproduced in the best possible way. So the sample flow itself, which is the part that I would like to present to you here, we can just pivotal around the central element of the biobank with the storage. Here we store elements over here. From a storage, we can bring the samples down to the principal investigator, and into the storage are coming the samples which are collected from the donors. So I will go to you with you one by one, step by step through this whole process. And the first part of the sample process flow is the collection of the sample. The collection of the sample is done on a voluntary basis. We simply cannot go around and force people to donate. It is the part of the principal investigator or a physician or the nurses who are the research nurses involved in the projects to talk to potential donors and show them the importance of the project where they can donate their material to. This all has to be done with a proper consent form, and everything is done according to GDPR regulations, which are in Europe quite strict. So before we can collect any given sample, all elements of, let's say, the juridical part must be fulfilled before we can really start collecting a sample element. And this is a very important aspect. It's also the part that you can really share the information with the people who are involved, because the majority of the persons who donate are suffering from the disease, which is part of the research to combat this particular disease part. So it really helps to inform the people that they are engaged in giving their material, which can sometimes be very painful to the sample collection, to this particular study. And at the end, of course, we have this informed consent from the donor, and then we also get the subject information sheet. What do we collect? So what are the collection points? There are two types of collections. We have the, I would say, two arms. We have the actual biospecimen and we have the biodata, and both are really needed for optimal information per sample to be used also downstream. For a biospecimen, of course, it is quite clear. The standard ones that we collect with all our studies are blood, there are saliva, urine. A stool is also very important as a biomarker of, let's say, standard health, and tissues too. And with all this type of material, we have only half of what we need, because we all need this biodata linked to all those specimens. The biodata is, of course, demographic, like your sex, your age. It is your disease status. Are you only or the other, in which particular cancer level, or in which particular level of Parkinson's disease. There's going to be a questionnaire normally based on the project itself. The disease history is always good to have in order to see other underlying variations in, for example, DNA mutations or in proteins for metabolomic studies in the blood. And the informed consent form is essential before we can really start to do anything over here. For all clearness, within our biobank, so the IBL, we have a definition for the biospecimen and a sample. A biospecimen is a single specific amount of biomaterial. This can be just blood, it can be stool, it can be saliva. And a sample is this specific type of biomaterial in a container where we label it in. So if we got the stool, we have a biomaterial, which is a specimen. If we put it into a tube with a label on it, it suddenly becomes a sample. This is the way that we are defining the process lines in order to make it easier to follow up the definitions. The biospecimen collection after we have the informed consent is done with kits. We supply, as the biobank, to all the collection sites bags with the tubes. And the tubes are already labeled with a unique 1 or 2D barcode and a human readable site. So whenever the samples are collected by the nurse or whenever the samples come here at the biobank, with one scanner, we can really already detect exactly what is the material. It's easy for traceability. It is also reducing the amount of errors, because if you have to type in or write in, it is always prone to give errors. And what we would like to do here is to reduce as much as possible errors or variabilities. The other elements inside the kit are material to support the collections. For example, if you collect saliva, you need a special type of device to get your saliva into the tube. If it is processed locally and not centrally at the biobank, we also supply the processing tubes. And we also, if it's going to be processed centrally, we supply the transport packaging and the airway bills in there. So a kit is designed per project. It's a very laborious process, but it's making life easier in view of the nurses who have to collect all the samples, and also for us downstream when we process and store the samples. The data collection, so this is the other arm of the material that we collect, which is done initially on paper, but it's very cumbersome afterwards to transfer all this data, which is collected on paper, into an informatics system, which can easily be used for sorting and for combining data. We are now stepping over to the more digital type of data collection, where easy scanning of tubes and also easy pop-down menu information entry reduces also the variability of the information in there. And plus, it is directly accessible for all the participants in the study, depending, of course, also on the allowance that everybody has in view of GDPR, because not everybody is allowed to see what is going on with the donor. And for that, this is the bottom line of this slide, the pseudo-anonymization of the elements that we collect over here is really the essential element to give the confidentiality to the donor. We here at the biobank, we don't have that key, which is translating what we then have on our 2D barcode or 1D barcode label tube to the actual donor of the sample. We simply don't know. It is done at the nurse level, or it's done at the physician's level or principal investigator level, who has the key to link the data and the samples that we create with our barcodes to the actual donor. But in view of the limit of information, we at the biobank, we simply do not know. So we have the samples collected. And then there is, in view of the optimal type of processing, the centralized processing, the need to get these samples to this laboratory who is taking care of it. And this is something that we should not underestimate. It is a very expensive endeavor. Transport is costing quite a lot. And it should also be controlled, because we need to know times, we need to know the temperatures. It's all very important in view of the pre-analytical variability, and also for the fit for purpose for samples, that this type of transporting conditions is well registered. So what we also need within the transporting structure is that the transporters are ADR and IATA compliant. ADR is road transport and IATA is air transport. We are talking here about biological samples. And if we are, for example, looking into, let's say, infectious diseases, it is very important that those samples are transported in a very safe way, that if an accident does occur, that this type of biomaterial is not causing any other complexity for the transporters themselves. And so for this, biological samples are not transported in general by the post. These are normally transported by special couriers like World Courier or Biologistics or Market. And we at the IBL, we have an IATA certified staff, so we can also look in the way that these samples are well packaged in order to be, let's say, safe for transport to these particular areas. So we have the samples collected, they are transported, and then they come to the centralized lab, which in this case can, of course, be the Integrated Biobank of Luxembourg. The first thing that we do when the samples come in is the sample reception. And for this, we use again this barcode, which is lying on top of the tubes that we receive, or blocks that we receive, in case of formalin-fixed paraffin embedded samples. The reception department is checking the quality of the sample, is also checking the quality of the transport. In a certain type of transport, we add special markers for temperature. So we know that the temperature of this transport has not been below or above a certain restricted temperature, which might also compromise the quality of the sample. It's also looking at the volumes, if the size and the structure is in line with the expected standard operating procedures, predefined elements. And of course, checking if the tube is still intact. So it's sometimes, even though they are nicely packed in, it could be that you have a broken tube. And of course, that means that we cannot process those samples further. We cannot store them, but we have to inform the principal investigator and also the other partners within the project that this particular sample is lost. And this all has to be traced and registered. The biospecimen and sample inventory, this registration is done in this laboratory information management system. This is the heart of the biobank in a way, or it's the brain of the biobank. This is where we store all the data. When the sample comes in, who is actually taking care of the sample reception, who is taking care of the processing, when it is processed, at what temperature it's processed, and all the other aspects. And the other element, of course, which is done by the receptionist area, if there is something wrong with the sample, this is the time point that we, in the LIMS, are adding then those annotations. And the QC results are then, for example, this particular type of temperature logger. The biospecimen can then, or the samples can then go into storage, or they can go to the laboratory for further processing. Some samples, for example, urine, or no, not even urine, but hairs, for example, are directly stored without us doing anything with it for the time being. But the majority of the samples that we receive are to be processed into units which can be used for the research afterwards. And this is done at the biorefinery. So examples of sample processing is extraction of DNA, it is cell sorting, it is tissue block processing, and slide and image processing of those tissues, and in a whole set of data which is listed on this particular page. Next to the processing itself, the sample is also to be analyzed. There are two aspects of the analysis. One is what we call the quality check. So with this, we know, for example, if we extract DNA, that the ratio of the DNA on 260-80 or 260-30 in the cases of purity are within the range of expectation. We can also see with urine analysis if we have a too high or too low protein levels in urine. This is just what the general quality check on the particular sample. It doesn't really give us the information that is being asked as a end of sample lifetime information tag. But we can also do sample characterization. This is already a bit moving forward to the analytical part, but for example, it's looking at ELISAs, or it's looking at the capacity of amplifying a piece of DNA. So these elements can be done by a biobank. We have recently been merged together with the Luxembourg National Cytometry Platform. So also from a processing point of view, we have the capacity to do flow cytometry, cell sorting. We do also secretion and cell lysate analysis, and we have imaging capacity too these days. This was for the sample processing and sample testing. Then the heart of the picture, it's the storage. This is a biobank. And in the biobank, we bank all those samples over here. So this is a group of freezers or liquid nitrogen tanks, or even consider a 4 degrees or room temperature. Storage is not always done in cold. For example, if you look at dried blood spots, where you have a drop of blood which is being collected on a tissue paper or say an absorbent paper, this is stored at 4 degrees or at room temperature. So you don't need to have liquid nitrogen tanks. You don't need to have freezers in order to store your material in general. But all our freezers, and this is also part of our quality control device, are monitored. So we do know exactly what is the temperature each time of the day. We know also that our freezers are correct because we did an internal validation before we use those freezers. And all of our equipment is really traced and maintained according strict, predefined measurements. So again, the storage itself is, it's for equipment, I was a bit too quick, where we have indeed the qualifications temperature mapping, and we have the backup systems, and everything is of course also monitored 24 hours per day. So we have then the central storage, and in this case, it is waiting for the principal investigator to state, look, it's time, I want to have my DNA for doing my PCR material. And then it's about the sample distribution, and it's sending out for the actual final analysis. And this is normally not done within the biobank, but this is done at the site of, let's say, a third party or even the principal investigator's laboratory. So for distribution, again, this is done traceable. So we have clear indications when it's being collected out of our storage facilities by whom. And it's also been, of course, transported again, fully traced, fully controlled to our endpoint. So the idea is that we have from beginning to end a full traceable, controllable sample guidance. It was a bit theoretical in a way. So in view of a practical example, in Luxembourg, we also have COVID, and the biobank and actually the whole of the Luxembourg science community has participated in several of those COVID studies. So this is the overview of the sample processing within the pre-COVID study. And I will quickly guide you through the real life processing of those samples, where we have on 5 different sites, so 5 different hospitals, samples are collected by the nurses. And these nurses also give the donors a collection kit for stool. So stool is something that you cannot really collect on demand. So in this case, the donors can just, in the privacy and the relaxation of their own house, prepare the stool and put it into a stabilizer tube, completely well described, and send it over by post to the IBL. This is in a safe type of packaging element in there with good packaging instructions. So it is also the possibility to do home collections, not only done by nurses at hospitals. So next to the biosampling, we also have the data collection. The data collection, so who is the donor, age, and all the other information which is required, which is done in a program called REDCap. And there we have then within this particular documentation system, all the relevant information from all the donors assembled together. The transporting is done by a dedicated company. It is the Biologistics, who is having one vehicle who is just going around all those hospitals and picks up at one after the other all the samples and then drives them to the IBL. These type of vehicles have conditions for storing at room temperature 4 degrees or -20. So we have the capacity to continue a proper storage of all those biosampling material and also have it traceable, that we do have the correct temperatures for all the samples, even while they are processed. For the post samples, so the ones that are stool collected, we know that room temperature is absolutely no problem. The stool is collected in stabilizer solution, and therefore it is absolutely secure to transfer this also at room temperature. The samples come to the IBL twice per day, where we have then the receptionist going to pick them up and entering all the data into the LIMS and transfers those samples into the biorefinery, where we do, sorry about that, where we then, just one second. When we then do the serum aliquoting, we take stool aliquoting. Aliquoting means that we are processing the blood to spin it down, take off the serum or take off the plasma, also collect buffy coat, PBMCs. From the swabs, we can take off some fluids. We transfer the swabs to our partners at the LMS for doing COVID PCR for detection. But this is the part that we do all those processing. And then, of course, the samples are either frozen or they are transferred to the actual persons who are doing the later analysis of this. As already stated before, PCR on detection of the virus, but also looking at the seroconversion by checking IgA and IgG within the plasma units. And all this data in the end, sorry, I'm going the wrong side. All this data in the end is, of course, being collected again in a centralized data storage warehouse where also the information from REDCap is combined so we can really see the original of the donor and also the end results of all the analyses. And of course, the end part of all this work is then ending up in a nice publication. I think from Predi, we have already multiple publications coming out showing that this type of processing line is successful in getting the research presented to the community in a good and concise way. Just a few numbers on the biobank. So we are there already for 10 years, but in the last years, we are exponentially expanding our processing and collection items. So 2019, we had 13,000 kits. In 2020, 31,000 kits. This is just a triplication of the output that we have, predominantly in view of the COVID studies, which were quite large endeavors. And the same thing counts for samples that we see from 2018, 2020, a rather big increase. And in total, we have over a few million samples stored in our biobank. And this is coming all back to the paradigm that we have. It is better samples for better data and for better science. And with this, I'm at the end already of my presentation. And I would like to thank Olga and Kati for really preparing it and you for paying attention to this.
Thank you very much, Wim, for that. And I'm not sure, we ran 2 COVID studies in Luxembourg and the protocols were very, very similar. Was that Predi-COVID or Convince, Wim?
So this was Predi.
Ah, that was Predi-COVID, because just to put it in...
So you're right, This was Convince.
That was Convince.
Because we had 5 hospitals for this. And,
well, no, just so you realise, I'm on the executive committee of that study and Cyriel's first paper was on that study as well. But that was actually looking at early life and childhood trauma and then the risk of being seroconverting during the early stages of the pandemic. Okay? Just to bring it to you, that everything that Wim is talking about, it's not theoretical. You want a study and you want your samples and you have to think about this. And for biologists, this is now becoming our everyday life. So Wim here knows pretty much everything there is to know about biological sampling and then looking after your samples afterwards. So if you've got any question, just shout them out to Wim.